Hi, boys and girls. Let's see here. Today we're going to read pages, starting at page 58 of all the grays on Greene Street. And I'm reading to you from my craft room, which has been turned into kind of my office. So, all right, the last of the heroes. Alex caught up with me at the corner of Spring Street and held out half the peanut butter on health bread that Linda puts in his pocket for lunch, even though he always gets pizza. I was hungry enough to forgive him. Protein, he said. That was his way of making fun of Linda, because protein is pretty much her favorite topic of conversation. Linda drives both of us nuts. Still, I sometimes wondered if I would mind having the kind of mom who worried about what you ate. Remember, because her mom's in bed. There's a playground closer to our house, but we always go to the one in Washington Square Park because of the terror pole. The terror pole is a tall platform in the playground with rungs up the side so you can climb it. Richard and I call it the terror pole because it's surrounded by concrete, and if you fall off one of the little stands on the way up, you'll become splatter. But Alex loves it so much, he should marry it. I finish the sandwich and wipe my hands on my jeans. Remember that Alex is the one that can climb the side of her building. After Bobby Sands died, I said as we crossed Houston, that's a street, Houston Street. After we crossed Houston, 100,000 people lined the streets for his funeral. The sentence came out sticky. There's not enough spit in the world for peanut butter on health bread. I thought you didn't want to talk about Bobby Sands, Alex said. Also, stickily, without looking at me. I guess he was still a little bit mad. I didn't. How come? I don't know. Of course I did know. The bad feelings I got from knowing about Bobby Sands made the bad feeling I had about everything else look worse. I kept my head down as we passed through Richard's courtyard. There's a statue there with a lady with both eyes on one side of her head, like two sunny side-up eggs. I'm not crazy about it, even if it is a Picasso. Outside of Richard's building, I sat down while Alex jumped up on his pet ledge. When Alex gets obsessed with a trick, he does it over and over and over again until he's mastered it, and then he finds something harder and does that over and over again. He's been practicing this one move for a while, jumping up onto a step from a standstill, keeping his legs together the whole time. He'd gotten so he could jump up 100 times in a row on a regular stair, but a ledge was higher and hard for him. I couldn't do it at all. This meant that we were spending a lot of time outside Richard's building, though, because there was a ledge there that was precisely the right height. So I would assume that would be kind of like what people call a box jump, and which is where you stand still and you jump up on top of boxes. If you haven't tried it, try it on a step or something. On the way over, he'd set himself a goal of 30. It was hard to do, so he had to go slow. I took out my notebook. We were going to be there for a while. I started to draw him silhouetted against the sun, the tight curve of his neck as he gathered himself to jump. But the pebbly sand-colored stone was warm and rough against my back, and the pencil felt fat in my fingers. So I leaned back on my elbows and basked instead, listening to Alex's breathing get heavier as he jumped up and jumped down. I guess I dozed off. I hadn't slept that well the night before. What with worrying about my mom and my dad and poor dead Bobby Sands and all the rest of it, I woke up to the nap taste in my mouth, something velvety and wet licking at my ankles. I held very still and squinted one eye open. Richard had come downstairs while I was asleep. He was sitting next to me, looking through his own notebook, a huge scrapbook of monsters that he calls the taxonomy. He did not seem to be alarmed. Alex was standing near his pet ledge, the sweat dripping off of him to make dark spots on the concrete between his feet. He was talking to Joyce Walker, who lives in her husband Peter's gallery above that she runs on Wooster Street. Mystery solved. Joyce's chunky yellow Labrador retriever, Saint Fall, was diligently using her tongue to cover every exposed inch of my rolled up jeans and my sneakers, like someone had hired her to clean my ankles. Ooh, that sounds gross. It wasn't a completely unpleasant feeling, to be honest. Alex towered over Joyce, who looked like a plump little bird next to him. Am I shrinking? She asked with a funny old lady hunch, then nudged Richard over on the ledge so she could sit next to him. My dad says that Joyce learned everything she needed to know about working with artists from having 4 boys who were all teenagers at the same time. Her kids are all grown up now, so she likes to visit us. That's what she calls it, visiting. I've done quite a lot of work on the taxonomy since I last saw you, Richard volunteered, spinning it around on his lap so Joyce could see. The taxonomy is an enormous scrapbook with pictures and detailed descriptions of every monster Richard knows about, or organized by their characteristics. Is the monster humanoid, mammalian, or reptilian? Does it walk on 2 feet or 4? Is it little or big? Is it slimy or scaly? Where does it live? What does it eat? Mostly they eat people, as far as I can tell. How does it kill what it eats? Then all the monsters are cross-referenced with one another across their categories. Joyce thinks the taxonomy has the makings of a really interesting art project, but Richard thinks of it as a science project, even if monsters aren't real. Richard is probably going to be a scientist when he grows up. My dad says he was put on Earth to make monster movies, but his mom wants him to get a real job. Alex is going to be a stuntman, so he can get thrown out of windows and dangle from helicopters and balance on top of speeding cars like he's surfing. I'm going to be an artist. I don't know what I'm going to do for money. Joyce turned the page, and Richard pointed to one of the drawings. Ollie drew that for me. There were a lot of drawings in the taxonomy. When Richard started it, most of the monsters were ones that he'd seen at the movies, cut from the monster magazines he buys. More recently, though, he started researching monsters from other countries at the library and making some others ones up. He'd gotten pretty good at telling me what he saw in his head. Joyce leaned in close to look and nodded. I flushed with pleasure. I'd seen her look at art with my dad enough to know that nod was a compliment. I didn't mention that I'd based the grainy texture of monsters' yellowy fangs on St. Paul's teeth, but seeing the way I'd made the monster's spit hang down in thick, ropey strings like snot made me pull my soggy ankles up over the old dog's reach. Insulted, she sniffed at the rubber bottoms of my shoes for a bit, then lay down with a satisfied grunt and closed her eyes. She knew she'd done a good job. I'm sorry, I'm having a tough time reading today. Joyce was still looking at the drawings I'd done. On the opposite page was a picture of the monster from Alien that Richard had cut from the People magazine. He must have opened the taxonomy up on the mucus section. You're getting good, Olympia, was all she said, and my chest hummed. Richard turned the book around and started flipping through the pages excitedly. I need a whole new section now on transformations. People and other animals turning into monsters, monsters turning into other monsters, bizarre mutations, werewolves, selkies, the fox people that the Japanese called kitsune. It will inspire a substantial amount of work. It will require a substantial amount of work. He looked about as happy as I'd ever seen him. Joyce leaned over to pick up St. Paul's worn leather leash. Transformation is a subject worthy of you, Richard. She turned to me then, the leash jangling down slack to the slumbering dog. Speaking of change, Ollie, how are you holding up? She was looking at me the way I'd seen her look at an artist who delivered a pathetic excuse for being late to turn in work for a show. I thought she might somehow know about my mom, so I stood there, not saying anything, as the question changed in her face with every second I didn't speak. Then I realized she was talking about Dad. It's okay, I guess, I said. I miss his cooking for sure. And then, like it was no big deal, are you in touch with them at all? No, ma'am, I'm not, she said, the South in her voice chewier than usual, and I believed her. I've left a couple messages for your mama, but she hasn't run me back, Joyce said. I looked down at St. Paul, stretched out on her side, the occasional snore escaping her loose black lips. I think she's working pretty hard. You know, she's got that show in the fall. Joyce nodded, her lips pursed. This was a sore subject. Joyce had represented my mom before she'd gone with the fancy gallery uptown. She started to say something else, then stopped, angling her head to one side like a parakeet. Did your dad say anything to you the night he left? That startled me. There had been a bunch of people out at our house that night, coming down from the studio in a steady stream. Even after I'd brushed my teeth and gone to bed, they'd come to see the head, a small piece of painted wooden statuary my dad and Apollo had been hired to restore. Joyce had been there too. The head was a big job for my dad and Apollo, and unusual. It was much, much older than the pieces they usually worked on, for one thing. The client was a Dortmunder collection, a small museum in a mansion uptown that had once been some rich guy's private collection. Apollo hadn't been happy about the head, even though She should have been right up his alley. But my dad had been really excited. In fact, the first time he'd shown her to me, I'd had the feeling that he was a little bit in love with her. Later, when I knew more, I thought it was probably his feelings about voulez-vous spilling over. But the weirdest thing is that I wouldn't have blamed him if he had been in love with her, with the head, because she was beautiful. Not pretty like a movie star, but the kind of beautiful that comes from never thinking anything mean, even if it's funny. I couldn't stop drawing her, trying to figure out what exactly the artist had done to make her radiate goodness the way she did. Whether it was the gentle slope of her cheek or her melancholy smile or the sweet way she was looking down. Even though I filled whole paths with those sketches, I never got close to capturing her beauty or that look. The head was just perfect, right up until you got to the bottom of her, to the raw, ugly scar where she'd been ripped from her body. There's a picture. Every time, it was a shock to follow the flowing lines of her face down to that violent stump of splintered wood. It changed the way you looked at her, as if the soft sadness in her face had come from suspecting that someone would eventually do something horrible. Restoring the head should have been a good job for Apollo and my dad, but she'd caused a lot of problems. I'd heard my dad and my mom fighting about her, late at night, when they thought I was asleep. My dad and Apollo had fought about her too. Apollo was the one who had called voulez-vous in the first place. She was an old friend of his, a visiting conservator at the Met, and he thought they needed her help. That had caused another fight, although I guess my dad and voulez-vous had worked it out in the end. Remember, voulez-vous is the person that Olympia thinks her dad ran off with. Anyway, the night he left, right after I'd fallen asleep, my dad had come into my room to kiss me goodnight. "Take good care of your mama, Allie," he whispered. "I've got to take the lady home." I thought he was talking about Joyce. He'd always walked her back to her house after dinner if Peter didn't come, even though she always told him not to bother, that nobody in their right mind was going to bother with a tough old bag like her. But that night, he must have meant that he was taking voulez-vous back to France because that was where my mother, eyes tight and tired over her mug of tea the next morning, had told me he'd gone. And I'd felt a clutch of sadness because even though I'd swum up through my dreams to meet his kiss and the familiar leather and coffee smell of him, I hadn't made myself wake up all the way I would have if I'd known he were saying goodbye. "He said he was going to take somebody home," I told Joyce. "I thought he was talking about you." Joyce shook her head quickly. When she looked back at me, she was chewing on the inside of her cheek like she was trying to figure out how much to say. Then she looked back up to the sky between the buildings and said, "Never one to pass up a grand gesture, your dad. The last of the heroes." Alex looked over, panting slightly. "He's interested in heroes." I looked at Joyce too, curious how she meant it, but she was looking down at St. Paul, heroically chasing squirrels in her dreams. Joyce jangled the leash a little to wake her up and said, "It's time, old friend," in the same tone of voice she had said to me. "Listen, you don't hesitate to call me or Peter if you need anything, you hear?" Peter is a great cook. He runs a framing business from their loft above Joyce's gallery, and Apollo and my dad always call him if they have a complicated engineering puzzle to solve. Everyone knows that Joyce has a great eye for new work and that she's good at helping young artists to stop acting like idiots. But if they didn't know how to get in touch with my dad, then I couldn't imagine anything I would call them for. I nodded again anyway. "Thanks, I will." "Now, Nana," she said to St. Paul. At this time, it was clearly a command. The old dog got to her feet with a wheeze and one last regretful sniff in the general direction of my dampened ankles. He's a good sport, but she really doesn't enjoy the exercise part of the walk anymore. She's a good sport, but she doesn't really enjoy the exercise part of a walk anymore. I turned back to my friends. Alice had gone back to his ledge, and Richard was lost in the taxonomy. I sat down next to him again, Joyce's words buzzing around my brain. The last of the heroes. I had no idea what she meant. Makes me wonder if when he talks about taking her home, were they really talking about voulez-vous, or were they talking about the statue that he was cleaning up? I don't know. Tune in next time to see what happens. Bye-bye.